she was just a girl, really. Barely 20, though life had aged her in ways no calendar could count. Her name was Liana, and when she stepped across the cold marble floors of that big empty house on Willow Hill Road, she didn't look like someone who had dreams left, only duties. The baby wasn't on the resume. Of course not. She never meant to bring him here. But desperation folds people into corners they never imagined. The agency didn't ask too many questions, and the man who hired her didn't ask any. Mr. Thorne, tall, suited, with a face carved by decades of silence and grief. He lived alone in that house with more rooms than reasons to keep them open. A widower, people said. A millionaire, others whispered. But mostly he was a man who walked through his own home like a ghost dressed in linen. Liana was quiet, efficient, careful. Every morning she polished the glass so well she could almost see the version of herself that once believed in fairy tales. And every afternoon she went to the attic, room 12, farthest from the master wing. She carried a small bag of bottles, a few worn-out toys, and sometimes warm formula, hidden in a thermos meant for tea. The baby was always there, wrapped in a faded blue blanket, cheeks too pink for his own good. She called him Luca. He wasn't sick, but he wasn't thriving either. There was no cooing, just the slow, confused breathing of a boy who had learned, far too young, how to stay quiet. She thought she could manage both lives, dust the antiques, hush the child, clean the crystal, cradle the boy, sweep the sorrow, sing a lullaby. But houses like Mr. Thorne's have a way of listening. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the silence broke. Mr. Thorne was walking past the narrow staircase when he heard it, a sound too soft for alarm, but too human to ignore. It wasn't a cat, wasn't the wind. It was a baby's cry. He froze. His breath caught somewhere between memory and disbelief, and then, without calling her name, he climbed 12 steps, a hallway of locked doors, and then room 12. When he opened it, the air shifted. Liana stood with her back to him, gently rocking something wrapped in blue. The bottle in her hand trembled. She didn't turn around. Not yet. But her voice, barely more than a whisper, said everything. I just needed a safe place. Mr. Thorne's eyes widened. His heart didn't soften. Not yet. He stepped back. His voice was cold, final. You're dismissed. Immediately. And with that, the girl holding the child was left holding a silence too heavy for her arms. But what neither of them knew then was that this baby had thorn blood in his veins. And the truth, it was about to unravel everything. If you've ever felt the sting of being pushed away just when you needed someone to see you, then come closer, darling. This story has more to say. He didn't sleep that night. The house was quiet again, but not in the peaceful way he was used to. No. This silence had a heartbeat behind it, a ghost of something recent and real. Mr. Thorne stood in his study long after the fireplace dimmed, staring at the only photograph he'd kept on display. A girl, brown eyes, hair like wheat in summer. His daughter, Caroline, the one he hadn't seen in 7 years, not since she vanished from college and sent a letter 2 months later, saying she didn't want to be found. That was it. No return address, no more birthdays. No more holidays. Just gone. He blamed himself, of course. That's what fathers do. He had been strict, demanding, always expecting her to be composed, brilliant, perfect, like her mother, like the image they'd built. But Caroline had needed softness. He hadn't offered that. And now, in a dusty attic, he'd just expelled a girl who looked heartbreakingly familiar, holding a baby whose eyes... He shook his head. No, it couldn't be. Still something gnawed at him. He opened the drawer beneath the photo and pulled out a faded envelope. Inside, the last piece of his daughter he owned, a torn corner of a hospital intake form. It wasn't much, but it had a date. Born February 9th, Liana's baby. She'd written the date down on the emergency contact form the agency required. He remembered it only because it had matched the anniversary of his wife's death, February 9th. His hands trembled. At dawn, he called the agency, asked where they'd placed her. The woman on the line refused, said it was against policy, said she'd already left the temporary housing. No forwarding contact. She's on her own again, they said. And Mr. Thorne, A man who hadn't driven himself in 10 years pulled out a coat and started the engine of his late wife's sedan. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he had to try. Meanwhile, Liana sat on a bus bench 3 towns away, hugging a baby that had barely slept. Her last diaper was gone. Her phone was dead. Her shame was loud. And then she saw something in her backpack she didn't remember packing. An envelope. Inside, $500 in crisp bills and a note. "I heard the baby cry. I didn't hear yours. T." She stared at it for a long time, then closed her eyes. But across the street behind a tinted windshield, a familiar man was watching. He hadn't approached yet, but something in his eyes had changed, and what she would do next would change everything. The motel smelled like old lemons and borrowed time. Room 6B had a crooked lamp, 2 towels that didn't match, and a heater that groaned louder than it warmed. But to Liana, it was safety, not comfort, just safety. For one night, maybe 2, long enough to figure out what to do next. She laid Luca down on the bedspread, folding a towel beneath his tiny head. He whimpered, not quite crying, just confused, hungry again maybe. Or maybe he could feel the way her heartbeat skipped, unsteady, uncertain, stretched too thin. Liana sat on the edge of the bed, holding the note. "I didn't hear yours." She hadn't cried, not when she got fired, not when she walked 4 miles carrying her baby in a sling made from an old jacket, not when the motel clerk gave her a look that said, "Not another one." But now, under the yellow flicker of a light that buzzed like a trapped bee, the tears came. She cried for all the things she wasn't allowed to want, for the college scholarship she gave up when the test turned pink, for her mother, who told her to leave and never come back, for the boy who gave her a promise ring and then disappeared the day after she showed him the ultrasound. And she cried for Luca, sweet, silent Luca, who never asked for any of this. She didn't know where they'd sleep tomorrow. She didn't know if she'd be able to afford formula by the weekend. But still, she whispered over his tiny body, "You weren't a mistake. I just need to find a place where you can be loved out loud." Across town, Mr. Thorne sat in his parked car, outside the diner. He hadn't eaten, couldn't. The agency hadn't told him much, but he remembered something Liana once said, as she dusted the staircase. "There's a little place on Jefferson that still sells pie for $1. They don't ask why you're crying." That was 2 weeks ago, just a passing sentence. But tonight, Jefferson Street felt like a place to start. He left the car, walked past neon signs and tired waitresses, and into the motel parking lot behind the diner. It took him 3 passes down the corridor to recognize her voice behind the door. Soft, broken, singing, not to entertain, but to survive. And that's when he saw it, just barely, through the edge of the curtain. The baby, lying on the bed, wrapped in that same blue blanket, the same color his daughter Caroline had chosen for the nursery before she left. He took a step forward, then another, and raised his hand to knock, but stopped, because inside, Liana said something he wasn't meant to hear. "I think your grandpa would have loved you, baby boy, even if he never met you." His hand fell to his side, and for the first time in years, Thorne's heart broke without warning. But it was what she said next that left him gasping for air. "I almost named you after him," she whispered. Luca had just dozed off, thumb near his lip, breath steady like a lullaby. Liana leaned down and kissed his forehead, then brushed her hair back with shaking fingers. "Thomas," she said. "That was your grandfather's name. Thomas Thorne." Mr. Thorne stepped back from the door, as if it had burned him. The night was cool, but he was suddenly warm with a strange, paralyzing electricity. Not anger, not fear. Recognition. Liana had never said her last name. He hadn't asked, but now pieces started falling like autumn leaves after the first frost. Her eyes, that deep, thoughtful brown, the shape of her chin, the letter his daughter had written 7 years ago, the one he never showed anyone, signed, Caroline Thorne James. She hadn't dropped the Thorne. She had hyphenated it, James. His daughter had married, had a baby, and if Caroline was Liana's mother, then he gripped the motel railing to stay upright. Inside the room, Liana whispered into the dark, "Your mom was bright like spring. She smiled like she didn't believe in sadness. She used to say the world wasn't kind, but she'd find a way to be. Then she paused, and something in her voice changed. She died 2 weeks after you were born, sweetheart. Hemorrhage. They said it was rare. Said nothing could have stopped it. Mr. Thorne's knees buckled. He backed away from the door, clutching his chest, shaking, breath caught between grief and revelation. Caroline? Gone? He had imagined her living somewhere, quietly happy. Never had he pictured this. He had missed her wedding, missed her last breath, missed the birth of his grandson. And now he was standing outside a cheap motel, hearing the truth through thin walls and borrowed courage. He returned to his car, sat behind the wheel and stared into the dark. The guilt settled on his shoulders like snow that would never melt. But just before he turned the key, he looked at the motel window again. She was holding the baby now, singing something without melody, rocking slowly, and on her face was Caroline's gentleness. He wasn't ready to knock, not yet, but he knew he wouldn't leave, because whether she believed it or not, they were already a family. And when the motel manager knocked on Liana's door the next morning, holding a prepaid envelope and a room extension slip, she had no idea who had sent it. The next morning came gray and slow. Liana sat by the motel window, sipping lukewarm coffee from a paper cup, her eyes flicking between the street and the crib she'd made from a dresser drawer. She didn't trust gifts with no name. The envelope had arrived with no return address, just her name in block letters. Inside, another $200, a motel extension paid through Friday, and one simple note, "You are not invisible." She almost tore it in half, almost. But instead she tucked it carefully into the pages of the only book she'd brought, her mother's worn copy of The Secret Garden, the one with underlined passages and little notes in the margins. Caroline had written in it like a diary. Liana opened to the back cover and traced her mother's handwriting. And then, without knowing why, she packed up Luca, wrapped him tight, and walked to the Waffle House down the street. Sometimes when you're grieving, you move your body before your mind catches up. She took a booth in the corner, ordered eggs she couldn't afford, and juice for the baby she couldn't explain. And when the waitress brought the food, she smiled at the infant and asked, the way strangers do, with kindness too big for small moments, "First time, Mama?" Liana nodded, then looked down. Her voice cracked. "Kind of. My mama died right after he was born. I'm just trying to figure it out." The waitress sat down across from her without asking. "Well, honey," from where I'm sitting, "you're not doing half bad." Liana bit her lip, and that's when she said it, the thing she hadn't said out loud yet, not to anyone. "My mother's name was Caroline Thorne. She left home when she was 20. Her father never tried to find her. And now he's all that's left, but he doesn't even know I exist." The waitress froze. Her hand went slowly to her apron pocket. She fumbled with something. A pen? A receipt? Then she said, "Sweetheart, what if he does?" Liana blinked. "What?" The waitress looked around, leaned in. "That man who came in here last night. Tall, silver hair. Looked like he hadn't slept in years. He asked about a young girl with a baby. I told him nothing, but the way he looked..." She paused, shook her head. "It wasn't judgment. It was regret. I've seen men abandon, but I've also seen them return." Liana's chest tightened. She wanted to believe, but she'd lived too much life already to lean on hope. Still, that night, when she returned to room 6B, the flowers were there. Blue hydrangeas just like the ones in her mother's childhood photos. No card, just a folded note under the vase. "I didn't know she was gone. I didn't know about you." Her hands trembled, because only one man could have written that. And when she opened the door the next morning, she didn't expect to see him standing there. She didn't move at first. Just stood in the doorway, barefoot, baby in one arm, the weight of 7 quiet years on her back. Mr. Thorne didn't speak either. Not right away. He held his hat in his hands like it was a fragile thing, and his eyes, those tired, steely eyes, looked different now, softened, wounded. She stepped back to let him in, not because she trusted him, not yet, but because something in her mother's stories had always said he wasn't cruel, just closed. The room felt smaller with him in it, like the walls were listening. He looked at the baby first. Luca was blinking, half awake, little fists curled like seashells, Thorne didn't reach out. He just sat down on the edge of the bed and whispered, "I missed everything, didn't I?" Liana didn't nod, didn't answer. He went on. "I thought I had time. Thought silence was better than forcing her to stay. She said she needed space. I thought she'd come back when she was ready." He swallowed. "But I waited in the wrong way. I waited without reaching." Liana's eyes filled. "She waited for you. For months." The words were barely more than breath. Mr. Thorne looked away. A muscle in his jaw twitched. I should have gone after her. Silence fell like snowfall. Slow, relentless. Then he looked at Luca again. Not with pity, but with awe. "What's his name?" "Luca," she said softly. "Luca James." The corner of his mouth lifted. Just barely. "That was her husband?" Liana nodded. "He died before she did. Motorcycle crash. She never told you?" He shook his head. "She didn't tell me anything. I left her no space to want to." Liana sat across from him, arms folded. "Why now? Why come looking?" Mr. Thorne let out a long breath. "I fired a girl for hiding a baby. I didn't know she was family. But something about his cry. It sounded like something I'd lost, not something I was losing." She blinked hard. "You think he's yours now?" "No," he said gently. "I think he always was. I just didn't deserve to know it until I opened the door I should have knocked on 7 years ago." He stood slowly, walked to the window, hands trembling slightly. "I can leave if that's what you want. I just needed you to know. Someone should have come for you, for both of you. I should have." Liana didn't answer, not with words. She picked up Luca and placed him, carefully, quietly, in Thorne's arms. The baby stirred, blinked up, and did not cry. Thorne exhaled a shaky breath, cradling his grandson like something sacred. Outside, the sun began to rise, and in a room that once held only silence and fear, there was now something close to belonging. But when Liana reached into her bag later that evening, she found a letter she hadn't seen before. One written by her mother, never sent. She hadn't meant to find it. The bag was old. Her mother's, actually. All soft brown leather and fraying seams. Liana had carried it like an heirloom, even though it barely held anything useful anymore. But that night, after Mr. Thorne left, she reached into the corner pocket for a bottle, and her fingers brushed paper, folded, yellowing, and stitched deep into the lining. She tugged it free with careful hands, and there it was, her mother's handwriting, still looped and open, like it had always been, even in the margins of bedtime books. To Dad, dated March 17th, 2 weeks before she passed. Liana sank to the edge of the bed, heart thudding. The envelope wasn't sealed. She opened it. "Dad, I know you think I hate you. I don't. I just didn't know how to be loved by someone who needed me to be perfect. But I still remember how you used to carry me on your shoulders after your late shifts. I remember the way you never let me see you cry after Mom died, even when your hands shook. I named the baby Luca. He looks a little like you. Stubborn chin, watchful eyes. If something happens to me, please, don't let him grow up thinking he was a mistake. You don't have to save us. Just see him. That's all I ever wanted, for someone to see me. Love, Caroline." Liana sat frozen for a long time. The letter trembled in her hands. Her mother had written it, folded it, hidden it. Maybe she'd planned to send it. Maybe she was too afraid. Maybe she thought she had more time. But now it was here. And Liana felt like she was holding both grief and healing in the same breath. She tucked the letter gently back into the envelope, not to hide it, but to keep it safe. The next morning, when Mr. Thorne came back to bring fresh clothes for Luca, she handed it to him without a word. He read it leaning against the car door. And when he was done, he looked at her with eyes that no longer needed apology, only presence. "Thank you," he whispered, "for letting me know she never stopped needing me." He looked at Luca, nestled in a sling against Liana's chest. "I won't walk away again." Liana didn't say, "We'll see." She didn't say, "You better not." She simply said, "Good." And then, for the first time in her life, she let someone else carry the diaper bag. But that night, as they sat together in the motel parking lot sharing fries from a paper bag, Mr. Thorne asked a question that caught her heart in its tracks. The baby was asleep, curled in a second-hand bassinet they'd placed beside a pair of vending machines. The air smelled like grease and pavement. But The moment, oh, the moment felt soft, like it had been waiting its turn to arrive. Mr. Thorne picked at his fries like a man who hadn't tasted fast food in a decade. And then, casually, like he wasn't holding a live wire, he asked, "Why isn't my daughter's name on Luca's birth certificate?" Liana blinked. The question came too quiet to dodge. She looked down at her hands. "I wasn't with her when he was born. She was alone." A beat. "I was 17, she said, more to the air than to him. Mom got pregnant her first year in grad school. She'd already married James, but by the time she found out, he was sick. Cancer. Didn't even make it through her second trimester." Mr. Thorne's lips parted. He hadn't known any of this. "She didn't tell you," Liana added softly, "because she thought you'd try to fix it instead of feel it." A long silence settled between them. Then she went on. "She gave birth early. Complications. The paperwork got rushed. They listed her under her married name. She signed as Caroline James. I think she thought she'd fix it later." Her voice broke then. "But she never made it out of the hospital." Mr. Thorne looked down at the bassinet, then up at the stars. He swallowed. "He's mine. I mean, he's yours, of course. But I see her in him." Liana nodded. "Me too." He looked back at her. "We could change the certificate. Add her name. Yours too." She shook her head. "I don't want my name on his life because of legal forms. I want it to mean something." "It already does," he said quietly. The wind shifted. Somewhere in the distance, a train passed. Long, slow, humming like a lullaby from another life. And then, with his voice barely above a breath, Mr. Thorne asked, "Would you consider coming back to the house? Temporarily. As guests, not staff. There's space. Real space. And I think she'd want it." Liana didn't answer right away. She stared out at the dark road, where headlights came and went like distant hopes. And then she nodded, just for a little while. But deep down, something inside her whispered, maybe longer. But when she arrived at the house that weekend, there was something waiting for her in her mother's old room. A diary, and a truth she never expected to read. The room hadn't changed, not in the ways that mattered. The wallpaper was still lavender with little faded roses near the ceiling. The dresser still had the same mirror, the one with a chip in the lower corner that Caroline once blamed on her clumsy teenage years. And the closet, it still smelled like her perfume. Liana stood in the doorway holding Luca against her chest. Mr. Thorne had walked them inside with a quiet reverence, and then stepped away, giving her space. He didn't hover, didn't explain, just turned on the hallway light and said softly, "It's still hers, if you want it to be." She crossed the threshold. The crib her grandfather had reassembled stood beside the window. A rocking chair, newly cushioned, clean sheets, a faint nightlight glowing like a pulse from the past. But it was the bed that held the greatest surprise. On the quilt, folded neatly, sat an old hardcover notebook, fabric-bound, purple ribbon. Liana picked it up like a sacred thing. On the inside cover, in her mother's hand, it read, "If you're reading this, then you needed me. I'm still here, in words." She sat, open to the first page. The entries were dated, from her mother's first year in college all the way to Luca's birth. Some pages were joyful, descriptions of books and professors and late-night coffee with James. Some were raw, about loneliness, about not feeling enough, about how quiet grief can feel when everyone thinks you're fine. But then came a passage that made Liana stop breathing. "I'm almost 7 months along. I haven't told Dad. I don't think I will. He doesn't have space for my softness. Never did. But I still remember the day he taught me how to make scrambled eggs, just the way Mom used to. I was 9. I'd spilled the whole pan. He didn't yell. He just said, 'Start again, baby.' That's how we learn. Sometimes I think he's not heartless, just scared, the kind of scared that turns into silence." Liana closed her eyes. Her hands trembled. It was the same way she felt now, scared of being too much or not enough. But her mother had felt it too, and she had still loved, still tried, still hoped. She turned another page. "If something happens to me, I hope my baby finds someone who doesn't try to fix the broken, just sits with it. I hope he knows he was never unwanted, not even for a second. And I hope Liana, if she finds this, knows she made me brave." Liana wept, not loudly, not like a storm, like rain tapping a window, constant, quiet, cleansing. She rocked Luca until he drifted off, then tucked the diary into the drawer beside the bed. Down the hallway, she heard Mr. Thorne gently place something on the table. It was the picture of Caroline, smiling, carefree, before life demanded too much too soon. Liana tiptoed out and stood at the edge of the hallway. He saw her, straightened, and she asked simply, "Would you read it?" He didn't ask what. She didn't explain. She just held out the diary, and he took it, like a man being handed his own heart. But it was the final page of that diary, the one neither of them had turned yet, that would change how he saw everything, including himself. The diary sat on the kitchen table untouched for an hour. Mr. Thorne poured coffee but didn't drink it. He stared out the window, watching the wind stir the garden. For years it had bloomed untouched, his late wife's flowers growing wild, like forgiveness he never dared ask for. When he finally opened the diary, he did it slowly, not like a man invading privacy, but like someone stepping barefoot into a holy place. He read everything, from Caroline's laughter to her loneliness, from the thrill of James to the fear of motherhood. Her entries were alive with longing, with courage, with truth. He wept silently, face buried in his palm, and when he reached the final page, his breath caught. There, scribbled in the margin beneath her last entry, written in different ink, like an afterthought or a final whisper, was a name, not her own, not Liana's. "To my father, if you ever read this, I want you to know, his middle name is Thomas." He stared at it, long and hard, then read it again. He hadn't known. Liana hadn't said. But Caroline had already chosen to connect them, to make her father part of the boy's story. Luca Thomas James. That name echoed through him like a hymn. When Liana walked into the kitchen carrying the baby, she paused in the doorway, saw the diary open, saw his hand resting gently on the page. She didn't speak, but he did. His voice was quiet, trembling. "She forgave me." Liana nodded. "She never stopped loving you." He stood slowly, walked over, and gently took Luca from her arms. "Thomas," he whispered, "after all this time, you were always here." The baby stirred, then nestled into his shoulder like he belonged there. "Messa." Thorne held him tight, and then, without meaning to say it out loud, "I thought second chances didn't come for men like me." Liana's voice came soft as a breath. "They don't. We give them." Outside, the sun caught the edge of the old swing set in the yard, the one Caroline used to push herself on until the stars came out. That night, Liana tucked Luca into a crib that wasn't borrowed. Mr. Thorne stood by the door, watching, quiet. Before she turned out the light, he said, "There's a room next to mine. It used to be the guest room, but if you want, I can paint it, build shelves, make it yours." She smiled, half in shadow. "We'll see." But in her heart, something had already settled. She wasn't hiding anymore, and neither was he. But 2 weeks later, on a quiet Sunday morning, an envelope arrived in the mailbox, and the name on it, it was one Liana hadn't heard since the day she was left at 16, barefoot and betrayed. The mailbox creaked when she opened it. Liana didn't usually check the mail. Mr. Thorne did that, always early, always with a quiet ritual of sorting through catalogs and bills and neatly stacking anything important by the fruit bowl. But that morning, he was still asleep. Luca had kept them both up with a stubborn cough, and the house had fallen into a soft kind of hush. So she went. There were flyers, a coupon book, a reminder from the pediatrician, and then a plain white envelope. No return address, no decoration, just her name, Liana James. Not Thorne, not Miss, not to the resident of, just her. She didn't open it right away. She brought it inside, made tea, fed Luca half a banana, and rocked him until he drifted off again. Then, with shaking fingers, she slid her thumb beneath the seal. The letter inside was handwritten, familiar. Her breath caught before she reached the second line. "Liana, I don't know if you'll ever read this, or if you'll even care. I didn't deserve a second chance with you, not after what I did. But I want you to know, I've thought about you every day since. I was scared. That's not an excuse, just the truth. You came into my life at a time when I didn't even know how to hold my own. I thought if I ran, I could pretend it never happened, but it did. And the baby, he did too. I heard what happened to Caroline. I only found out months later. I'm sorry for everything. If there's any space left in your life, even just enough for a photo, I'd give anything to see the face of the child I should have protected. Jace, Jace! She hadn't spoken his name in nearly 2 years. He was the boy who'd promised forever at 17 and disappeared before she heard Luca's second heartbeat. The boy who called her beautiful, with eyes full of fear, who walked away and never looked back. Until now. She read the letter twice, then once more. Part of her wanted to scream. Part of her wanted to cry. But mostly, she felt tired. Like the kind of tired that lives in the bones of a person who's carried too much alone. She tucked the letter under her teacup and went to find Mr. Thorne. He was sitting in the sunroom, feeding Luca tiny spoonfuls of mashed peach. He looked up. Something wrong? She held out the letter. His father. Thorne read it, quietly. No judgment, no sharp breath or furrowed brow. When he finished, he handed it back and simply said, "Do you want to write him back?" "I don't know," she whispered. And then, more to herself than to him, "I don't know if he wants the baby or to be forgiven." Thorne nodded slowly. Maybe both. She looked at her grandfather, this man who had once fired her without knowing her name, and saw the gentleness he was still learning how to carry. I don't want Luca to grow up thinking people who leave get to come back whenever they want." Mr. Thorne leaned forward, rested a hand on hers. "Then show him what it looks like when someone stays." That night she sat at her mother's old desk, pen in hand, and for the first time since becoming a mother herself, she wrote not from anger, but from peace. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Jace was already on a bus, headed toward Willow Hill, and carrying a truth of his own. He looked older. That was the first thing Liana thought when she opened the front door and saw him standing there. Jace wasn't 17 anymore. His hair was shorter, jaw sharper, shoulders broader. But his hands were the same, always fidgeting, like they didn't know what to do without her hand in them. She didn't say his name. He didn't say hers. Just stood there on the porch, where vines curled around the railing, and the afternoon light spilled like honey through the trees. "I wasn't sure you'd open the door," he said. She crossed her arms. "I wasn't sure I would either." Silence. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, creased, worn. "I wrote this a year ago," he said, "but I never sent it." He handed it to her. She didn't take it. "I got your letter last week. It was enough." He nodded, looked down. "I know I don't deserve to see him. I know that." Her voice stayed calm. "You left." "I did." "You knew I was pregnant." "I did." "And you disappeared." "I did," he said again, quieter now. "But I didn't forget." That's when she saw it, the way his eyes shined. Not with performance, but with something raw. Regret, maybe, or memory. "I went into the Navy," he said. "Joined 6 months after I found out. I thought, if I became someone better, maybe I'd be worthy of being his father. I didn't think you'd ever forgive me, but I wanted to deserve it anyway." Liana felt something twist inside her. "I didn't need a soldier," she said softly. "I needed a partner, a father, someone who didn't run when it got real." He nodded, swallowed hard. "I can't undo the running, but I'm here now, not to take anything, just to meet him, if you'll let me." She didn't answer right away, but then, from behind her, came the sound of tiny feet on hardwood. Luca, sleep-rumpled, hair wild, dragging a stuffed rabbit by the ear. He toddled to the door and looked up at the stranger with eyes too wide, too familiar. Jace knelt, didn't speak, just looked at the boy like he was seeing the whole world in miniature. Luca tilted his head, then, without being prompted, reached out his hand. Jace broke, tears, quiet, shaking. He took the boy's hand in his, kissed the tiny fingers, and whispered, "Hi, I'm your dad." Liana didn't move, but in her chest, something shifted. Not trust, not yet, but something like the soft beginning of maybe. Behind her, Mr. Thorne stepped into the hallway, watched the scene without interfering. His voice came gently. "We all ran from something once. The question is, who do we choose to walk back to?" And in that moment on that porch, 3 generations stood in the golden light, none of them perfect, but all of them present. The sky that Sunday looked like it had been painted by a gentle hand. Not too bright, not too heavy, just enough clouds to feel soft, just enough breeze to carry the smell of grass and something baking down the road. Luca wore overalls with one button undone, because he never stood still long enough for both. Liana had tied her hair back with a ribbon her mother used to wear. And Mr. Thorne, he'd packed a picnic basket like he was preparing for royalty. It had been Jace's idea. Not to prove anything, he'd said. Just to be near him, with you, without pressure. So they'd agreed. A picnic, neutral ground, no expectations. Just a patch of green behind the Thorne house where time felt slower, kinder. At first it was awkward. Jace tried too hard. Liana smiled too little. Mr. Thorne sat on the edge of the blanket like a man trying not to crack porcelain, with his elbows. But then, Luca laughed. It was the belly-deep kind. The kind that turned strangers into storytellers. He'd seen a butterfly, and just like that, the air changed. Jace leaned back on one arm and told a story about Caroline, how she once chased a moth through the library because she thought it was leading her to adventure. Liana joined in with a story of her mother pretending to be a wizard when they were stranded at a bus stop during a rainstorm. Mr. Thorne, quiet as always, added a single line. She used to eat strawberries like they were secrets. They laughed, not loudly, but together. And when Luca smeared peach jam across his nose, all 3 of them reached for a napkin at the same time, their hands colliding, overlapping. Jace looked at Liana. You don't have to forgive me, ever. But I'll stay. I'll be here, whether I get to be his dad or just a man who never stopped wanting to. She didn't reply, but she didn't pull away either. Mr. Thorne, watching the scene unfold, reached into the basket and pulled out a small envelope. He handed it to Liana. I meant to give you this weeks ago. She opened it. Inside, a deed to a small cottage down the road, fully paid. Her name on the papers, and a handwritten note. A home of your own. Not because you can't stay here, but because you deserve the choice. Her throat tightened. You didn't have to. I know, he said. That's why it matters. The sun dipped low. Luca curled into her lap, and for the first time in years, her heart didn't feel divided between past and future. It felt full, whole. But later that night, as she packed up the picnic things, Jace placed something in her hand, something she never expected to hold again. It was the promise ring, the one he gave her when she was 16, and still believed love could fix everything. Liana stared at it in her palm, the tiny silver band with the turquoise stone he'd saved for all summer. It still had the small scratch from when they'd dropped it on the boardwalk, and laughed so hard they forgot the ice cream, melting down their wrists. I kept it, Jace said. I thought about pawning it, more than once, but something always stopped me. She didn't say anything, just looked at the way the light hit the stone, and how her hand no longer shook holding it. I'm not giving it to ask for anything, he added. Not marriage, not even a title. I just wanted you to know. I never forgot who I promised to be. She met his eyes. Then why did you leave? He took a deep breath. Not rehearsed, just raw, because I didn't think I'd ever live up to you. A silence passed. Then she whispered, and now? He looked at Luca, asleep on the couch with Mr. Thorne softly humming beside him. Then back at her. Now I don't care if I'm good enough. I just want to be here. Every day. Even the boring ones. Especially the boring ones. Liana reached out and gently closed his fingers around the ring. I'm not who I was back then, she said. I've changed. He nodded. Good. So have I. She smiled. Small, but real. Then stepped closer. Just enough for her shoulder to brush his. We start over. No promises. Just presence. He exhaled, the way people do when they've been holding their breath for years. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like an old hymn. Inside, Mr. Thorne stood and kissed Luca's head. Bedtime, he said softly, for all of us. And as Liana followed him up the stairs, Jace trailing quietly behind, something about the rhythm of their footsteps felt like a song she almost remembered. A lullaby, maybe, or the sound of home. But what none of them knew, as they tucked the baby in, was that the next morning would bring a decision that would shape the rest of their lives. The house was quiet. Sunlight spilled through the kitchen window, painting soft gold across the table, where a plate of tiny fingerprints dried in the sink. The radio hummed something sweet in the background. An old hymn, maybe. The kind people sing while folding laundry or holding memories. Mr. Thorne sat by the back door with a book in his lap, but his eyes weren't on the page. They were on the cradle. He'd built it with his own hands, the same ones that once held briefcases and contracts, and nothing else. Now they held screws and sandpaper, wood that had waited too long to become something that held life. He hadn't known how to build one, but he had learned. For Luca, for Liana, for redemption he never asked for but hoped, quietly, might come. The cradle rocked gently in the living room, near the fireplace. Luca slept soundly. Liana came down the stairs carrying a letter in her hand, sealed, stamped, addressed. Jay stood by the window, adjusting the tiny tie on the baby's spare outfit. They were getting ready for something, but not a court date, not a goodbye, a beginning. The letter was for the state. Liana had decided she wanted to list both fathers, biological and emotional, on the updated birth certificate. Because blood starts stories, she said. But presence writes the ending. Mr. Thorne smiled when she said it. He smiled more these days. Later that afternoon, they drove to the small cottage he'd signed over to her. It still smelled like fresh paint and lemon oil. The floors creaked like they were remembering something. There was a garden out back with space for strawberries, and a second bedroom with pale blue walls and a window that faced east, so Luca could wake with the light. She set the cradle in that room and sat beside it for a long while. She thought of her mother. Brave, brilliant, gone too soon. She thought of her grandfather. Cold once, but learning now to warm. She thought of Jace, not the boy who left, but the man who returned. And she thought of herself, a girl who once slept in motels, afraid of every tomorrow, now holding a baby in a home she could call hers. She reached into the diaper bag, pulled out her mother's diary, and placed it on the shelf above the cradle. Next to it, the promise ring. Not because she was promising anything new, but because she had already kept her greatest vow, to stay, to raise this child with love instead of fear, to let her story be rewritten, not erased, just softened at the edges. That night, Mr. Thorne stood at the threshold of the nursery. Luca stirred in his sleep, little hand curled beneath his chin. "I never thought I'd see another cradle in this family," he whispered. Liana turned to him. "You didn't see the first one," she said gently. He nodded. "And yet, here we are." He stepped closer, ran a hand across the smooth rail of the cradle. "Some stories don't come full circle," he said. "They come back, in softer shapes." Liana touched his shoulder. "This isn't a second chance just for you," she said. He looked at her. She smiled. "It's for all of us." And together, they stood in the glow of the nightlight, watching over the child who carried all their histories and all their hope. Some stories don't end with weddings. Some don't end at all. Some just rest gently in second cradles, where the silence is softer, the air is warmer, and two people, once strangers, can finally sleep in peace because the baby is safe, the house is full, and no one is alone anymore. If this story found a little corner in your heart today, leave a comment, won't you? We keep the porch light on here at Second Cradle. There's always room for one more story.